night had fallen relentlessly over St. Grace Hospital. In room 304, 8-year-old Ethan Parker fought silently against a fate that seemed inevitable. The sound of the heart monitor was intermittent, each beat weaker than the last. Sarah and Michael, his parents, sat beside the bed, unable to hold back their tears. Ethan's pale figure, eyes closed and breathing labored, was a blow neither of them knew how to bear. Next to him, Charlie, the loyal golden retriever, never left his side. Lying at the edge of the bed, the dog kept his snout resting on the boy's hand, as if trying to protect him from something invisible. As earlier, Dr. Richard Coleman had entered the room with a grave expression. "I'm so sorry," he said, his voice breaking the silence. "There's nothing more we can do. Ethan's heart is too weak." Those words seemed to rip the ground from under Sarah and Michael. They knew time was running out, but hearing the final verdict was unbearable. Since then, the room had felt like a prison of despair, where every second was filled with silent tears and lost gazes. But Charlie, for some reason no one understood, seemed unwilling to give up. The dog paced back and forth as though waiting for something. Suddenly, he stopped, ears perked up, his attention turned to the window where the full moon's light seemed to pierce through the glass with unusual intensity. It was as if he was sensing something the humans couldn't. The air in the room seemed to shift. Sarah, noticing the dog's restlessness, looked at Michael with a mixture of hope and despair. Suddenly, Ethan's heart monitor started beeping irregularly. The sound was a loud, shrill alarm that made Sarah scream, "Doctor, please come quickly." The medical team rushed into the room, chaos taking over the space. Dr. Coleman adjusted the equipment while the nurses tried to stabilize Ethan. Amid the confusion, Charlie leaped onto the bed, pressing his body against the boy's. "Get that dog out of here!" Dr. Coleman ordered, visibly annoyed. "No!" Sarah begged, her hands trembling. "Please let him stay. We've tried everything." The doctor hesitated but allowed it. Charlie lay next to Ethan, his deep breaths seeming to sync with the boy's. What happened next left everyone in the room frozen. The heart monitor began to stabilize. Slowly, Ethan's body moved. He opened his eyes for the first time in days and, with a voice weaker than a whisper, murmured, "Charlie, you didn't leave me." The silence in the room was deafening. Sarah's tears turned into sobs as Michael tightly held his son's hand. Dr. Coleman watched in disbelief, unable to explain what he had just witnessed. But there was something in Charlie's gaze that seemed to say he knew that somehow, something more powerful was at play. In that moment, one question hung in the air: how far can a dog's love go to save the one they love most? The relief in the room was instant, but no one could understand what had just happened. The doctors stared at the monitors as if they were witnessing something impossible. Ethan's eyes remained open, his breathing weak but steady, while Charlie lay next to him, as if his simple presence was the reason for the miraculous change. Sarah held her son's face in both hands, tears flowing endlessly. "You here, Ethan. You came back to us," she whispered, her voice choked with emotion. Dr. Coleman, still with an expression of disbelief, stepped forward. He looked at Sarah and Michael cautiously, trying not to give them false hope. "I don't know what happened, but Ethan is responding. We'll keep a close eye on him. This kind of recovery, it's unusual," he said, carefully choosing his words, as if he couldn't believe what he was saying. While Ethan's parents focused on him, something peculiar was happening to Charlie. The dog, normally energetic and full of life, seemed exhausted, as if he had carried an immense weight. He climbed down from Ethan's bed and lay on the floor, but his eyes never left the boy for a moment. Sarah noticed the change and stroked Charlie's head. "You saved Ethan, Charlie. You're our angel," she said, her voice full of gratitude. Despite Ethan's sudden improvement, tension still hung in the air. The doctor ordered a series of immediate tests to understand what was happening. The nurses began moving the equipment around the boy while he lay still, quiet but conscious. Sarah and Michael were instructed to wait outside, but neither of them wanted to leave the room. Something inside them told them Ethan needed them more than ever, and also Charlie. Meanwhile, Michael began to remember something he had read years ago. He looked at Sarah, hesitant, and asked, "Have you ever heard of cases where animals heal people? It's not scientific, but—" Sarah shook her head, still holding Ethan's hand. "Michael, I don't know what happened, but I'm starting to believe that Charlie did something none of us understand." At that moment, Ethan closed his eyes again, not out of weakness, but in a peaceful rest he hadn't had in weeks. And although the monitors showed stability, a mystery still lingered in the air. Was Charlie's love what saved Ethan? Or was there something deeper and inexplicable happening between them? By a tense silence and lingering questions, he was alive. His condition was stable, but the medical team couldn't explain what had happened. Dr. Coleman, known for his skeptical nature and confidence in science, spent hours reviewing the initial test results. Nothing seemed to justify Ethan's sudden improvement. Meanwhile, in the room, Charlie remained watchful, though his energy was visibly fading. Something about the dog's behavior was intriguing, as if he had sacrificed part of himself to save the boy. Michael couldn't take his eyes off Charlie. He remembered a story his grandfather had told him when he was little, about dogs who, in times of extreme need, could share their life force with the humans they loved. It was an ancient belief without scientific basis, but the image of Charlie beside Ethan brought the memory rushing back. He hesitated before sharing it with Sarah, but seeing the distant look in his wife's eyes, he decided to take the risk. "Sarah, Charlie, doesn't he seem strange to you? He looks tired, not like a dog who's been running all day, but something deeper." Sarah, still holding Ethan's hand, looked at her husband. "He is different, yes. But I can't help thinking he feels what Ethan feels, like they're connected in some way." As they whispered to each other, Ethan opened his eyes again. This time, he was more alert, and his lips formed a faint smile as he looked at Charlie. "He was with me the whole time, Mom," Ethan murmured. His voice was almost a whisper, but it carried a strength that made Sarah and Michael exchange surprised glances. "What do you mean, honey?" Sarah asked, leaning in closer to her son. "When it was dark, when I felt like I was alone, he was there. I could hear Charlie. He didn't let me go." Ethan's words filled the room with a heavy yet emotional atmosphere. Michael swallowed hard, trying to process what his son was saying. How could a dog be there, wherever Ethan was? He looked at Charlie again, who now seemed to be sleeping deeply on the floor next to the bed but with his ears slightly raised, as if still alert. Later that night, when the hospital finally became quiet and the nurse's frantic pace slowed, Sarah sat next to Ethan while Michael stepped out to get some coffee. It was then that Ethan said something that made her heart stop for a moment. "Mom, when I was in that dark place, I heard a voice. It was like Charlie was calling me. But not just him. I felt like someone wanted me to stay, like it was important that I didn't leave." Sarah, feeling a chill run down her body, couldn't respond right away. She could only think about the frightening yet comforting idea that there was something beyond what the eyes could see. Something, or someone, had worked through Charlie to bring Ethan back. As she held her son's hand, watching him sleep again, one question echoed in her mind. What else did Charlie know that they didn't? The following morning, the hospital room was enveloped in an eerie calm. Ethan was still fast asleep, but his breathing was peaceful, something Sarah hadn't seen in weeks. Michael sat in the chair beside him, his gaze fixed on Charlie. The dog remained lying in the same spot, his head heavy on the floor. It was as if all the energy he had was focused solely on being there. Sarah noticed this as well and whispered, "Michael, have you noticed how he hasn't left Ethan's side for even a second? He hasn't eaten anything since yesterday." Michael nodded, but there was something else that troubled him. When he finally gathered the courage, he moved closer to Charlie and gently ran his hand through the dog's golden fur. Charlie didn't react immediately. He just lifted his tired eyes and let out a deep sigh. There was a sadness in them, mixed with something Michael couldn't quite describe. It was almost as if Charlie understood something that humans couldn't comprehend. Maybe he knows more than we realize, Michael murmured, almost to himself. Meanwhile, Ethan began to stir in bed. His eyes opened slowly, and when he saw Charlie on the floor, he reached out to touch him. Sarah immediately helped him sit up, concerned, but Ethan seemed determined. "I need him, Mom. He's the reason I'm here," the boy said, his voice still weak but firm enough to leave Sarah speechless. The moment was interrupted when Dr. Coleman entered the room, holding a clipboard with an expression that mixed relief and confusion. "Ethan, your tests are normal, but this doesn't make sense. There was no indication you could recover this quickly. I don't know how to explain it." He looked at Michael and Sarah, hesitating before continuing. "Did you notice anything unusual? Any changes that could have caused this?" Michael and Sarah exchanged looks. They didn't know how to explain what was happening without sounding insane. After all, who would believe that the bond between a boy and his dog could be the key to something so miraculous? "All we know is that Charlie hasn't left his side," Sarah answered, trying to keep her voice calm. "Maybe that helped." Dr. Coleman looked at Charlie, as if considering the unlikely possibility. He knew he couldn't base his conclusions on anything but science, but the intensity in the dog's gaze made him hesitate for a moment. "Well, we'll continue monitoring, Ethan, but I have to say this case is unique." When the doctor left, Michael approached the window, trying to find answers in the grey landscape outside. He knew something extraordinary was happening, something that defied any logical explanation. As he looked at Charlie, who now seemed even more exhausted, he felt a wave of guilt for not being able to ease the burden the dog seemed to carry. One thing was certain, though: Charlie was playing a role no one could explain. What motivated him? What did he know? And more importantly, how far would he go for Ethan? Charlie remained by Ethan's side, his eyes now dull and his strength visibly fading with each passing hour. Sarah felt a tighter knot in her heart as she watched the dog. He seemed to be losing something vital, but his determination to protect Ethan was unwavering. Michael began to notice small changes in the dog's behavior. He no longer reacted to sounds around him and didn't even lift his head when called. It was as if his very existence was being drained. Ethan, however, showed an improvement that no one could explain. That afternoon, he asked to sit at the edge of the bed, his voice once weak now sounding firmer. "Mom, I need Charlie to stay with me even if he's tired," Ethan said, gently holding the dog's leash. Sarah tried to hide the worry on her face, but Charlie's fragility was too obvious. Still, how could she deny her son when he seemed to be coming back to life after a nightmare? Michael, on the other hand, couldn't shake the feeling that something beyond his understanding was happening. During the night, he got up and went to the hospital hallway, where he stood watching the sky through the window. The stars shone brightly, but there was something unsettling about the scene. "How can this be happening?" he murmured to himself. "Why does it feel like Charlie is giving something of himself to Ethan?" When he returned to the room, he found Sarah sitting beside Ethan, who was sleeping peacefully. Charlie, as always, remained still on the floor, his eyes fixed on the boy as if standing guard. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft sound of Ethan's breathing. Michael felt a lump in his throat as he approached the dog. He kneeled beside Charlie and ran his hand over his head, whispering, "You're doing something none of us understand, aren't you? But at what cost?" The next morning, Dr. Coleman returned with more test results. He seemed incredulous as he spoke. "There's no way to explain this. Ethan is not only stable but showing signs of full recovery. If this continues, he might be discharged in a few days." He looked at the parents with a mix of joy and confusion. "But I have to ask, was there some intervention we don't know about?" Michael and Sarah hesitated. How could they explain that the beating heart in that room wasn't Ethan's, but Charlie's? That the dog seemed to be silently fighting for his owner in a sacrifice no one knew how far it could go? What no one could ignore was that every step Ethan took toward life seemed to cost a piece of Charlie's vitality. Michael, unable to bear the weight of the situation, stepped out into the hallway again, this time with tears in his eyes. Something was about to happen, something no one there could prevent. The night was silent in the hospital. Ethan slept peacefully while Charlie seemed more and more fragile beside the bed on the floor. The dog barely opened his eyes, as if the weight of what he had done was draining his strength. Sarah looked at him with a heavy heart, fearing what no one wanted to admit. Charlie was sacrificing himself. Michael remained by the window, watching the full moon light up the room. He felt a mix of gratitude and guilt, seeing the dog so worn out. Ethan, however, gently woke up and looked directly at Charlie. "Mom, Dad, he's tired. I know he helped me. He saved me," the boy said, his voice weak. Sarah stroked Charlie's head, tears streaming down her face. "You're our hero, Charlie, but now we need to take care of you." Michael tried to sound firm. "Ethan, we'll do everything we can for him. He'll be fine, just like you." Ethan slowly shook his head. "He protected me when I was in that dark place. Now he needs to rest." Michael decided to step out into the hospital garden, seeking a moment of clarity. Outside, under the silver moonlight, he felt a presence by his side. It was Charlie, who had somehow found the strength to follow him. The dog looked at Michael with tired eyes, but they were full of purpose. Michael kneeled down and gently held Charlie's face, tears welling up. "You telling me something, aren't you?" he whispered. "But why does it feel like you're saying goodbye?" Charlie softly licked his hand before lying down on the grass. Even exhausted, his expression was one of serenity. Michael felt the dog was trying to communicate something he couldn't fully understand. Back in the room, Sarah noticed Michael's downcast look. "What happened?" she asked anxiously. "He's showing us that all of this has a purpose," Michael replied, struggling to speak. "But I think we need to prepare for what's coming next." Once again, Charlie's presence brought questions without answers. How far would he went for Ethan? Morning arrived quietly in room 304, but the tension still hung in the air. Ethan was awake, watching Charlie with eyes full of worry. The dog remained by the bed, motionless, his chest rising and falling slowly as if each breath was a huge effort. Sarah adjusted her son's pillows, but her attention was on Charlie. She knew something was deeply wrong, but she didn't have the courage to admit it. Michael entered the room with 2 cups of coffee. He paused for a moment, observing the scene, Ethan holding Charlie's leash while Sarah gently stroked the dog's golden fur. The room was filled with a silent connection, something that went beyond words. Michael approached, handing one of the cups to Sarah. "He's still not up?" he asked, his voice soft. Sarah shook her head. "He won't leave Ethan's side. It's like he's forcing himself to stay here, even if it's costing him everything." Ethan looked at his parents, his voice soft but firm. "Mom, Dad, I want us to help Charlie. He helped me when no one else could. Now it's his turn." Michael felt a tightness in his chest as he heard those words. He knew Ethan was right, but how could they help an animal who seemed to be giving up its own life out of love? As he tried to find an answer, Ethan added, "I feel like he needs us now more than ever." Later that day, Dr. Coleman entered the room with an expression that mixed relief and curiosity. "Ethan is improving incredibly. If he continues like this, we might be able to discharge him in a few days," he said, trying not to let his disbelief show. Michael, however, couldn't fully feel joy. "And Charlie?" he asked, pointing to the dog by the bed. Dr. Coleman frowned briefly, glancing at Charlie. "He looks exhausted. Could be the stress. Animals can be very sensitive to human emotions. But other than that, I don't see anything obvious. You could take him to a vet to be sure." After the doctor left, Michael and Sarah decided they needed to take action. They called a local veterinarian, who arrived at the hospital that afternoon. The doctor, a kind-looking woman named Ellen, examined Charlie carefully. "He's very tired, but I don't see signs of physical illness," she said, gently petting the dog. "It's like he's emotionally drained." "Did you mention that he's been very close to Ethan?" Michael nodded, his voice choked. "He hasn't left Ethan's side since all of this started. It's like he's protecting our son from something." Ellen looked at the dog with a knowing expression. Dogs have a very strong bond with their owners. Sometimes they give of themselves in ways we, as humans, don't understand. Charlie seems to be carrying the weight of something only he can feel. As Ellen left the room, Ethan called his parents over with a serious look on his face. "I want Charlie to know how much I love him." "Do you promise he'll be okay?" he asked, his voice filled with emotion. Sarah and Michael exchanged looks, feeling the weight of the request. They didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain: the bond between Ethan and Charlie was beyond anything they could explain. Night had fallen over the hospital, bringing an unusual calm to room 304. Ethan, now sitting comfortably in bed, looked at Charlie with attentive, emotional eyes. The dog remained by his side, but his energy seemed almost non-existent. His breathing was slow, heavy, and the light in his eyes was beginning to fade. Sarah sat beside her son, holding his hand tenderly, while Michael, with his hands in his pockets, stood by the window. "Mom, I know Charlie is tired," Ethan said, his voice soft but filled with emotion. "He's still here for me, but I feel like he's trying too hard." Sarah took a deep breath, trying to hold back her tears. She knew Ethan was right, but the thought of losing Charlie was unbearable. "He's strong, my love. He's done everything for you, and somehow, he's still protecting you." Michael slowly turned, watching the scene with a weight that seemed unbearable. He approached the bed, crouched beside Ethan, and placed his hand over his son's. "Ethan, Charlie gave everything he could to save you. Maybe it's time to let him rest for a while. He did this because he loves you, but now he needs us to take care of him." Michael's words echoed in the silence of the room. Ethan looked at his father, his eyes filled with tears. "I know, Dad, but I want him to know that I'll never forget what he did for me. Never." During the night, the room was immersed in an almost supernatural calm. Ethan's monitor continued emitting its rhythmic signals, indicating that the boy was stable. However, by the bed, Charlie seemed different. His breathing was even slower, and he could barely keep his eyes open. When he opened them for a brief moment, he looked directly at Ethan, as if transmitting a final, silent message. Michael noticed the change and knelt beside Charlie, gently stroking his head. "You did something none of us can understand, kid. You gave everything for Ethan. Thank you. Thank you for being part of our family." The sun began to rise on the horizon, painting the sky with a soft orange hue. When Ethan woke up, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt in weeks. He looked around the room and realized that Charlie was still beside him, his head resting on his paws. The dog had finally found peace. Sarah approached Ethan, wrapping him in a tight hug. Michael, with tears streaming down his face, placed his hand on their shoulders, creating a silent bond between them. They knew Charlie had passed, but his presence was still strongly felt in the room. As the sun illuminated the early moments of the morning, they all understood that Charlie didn't just save Ethan but also left an eternal lesson: unconditional love has the power to transform lives and remain alive even when the body is gone. The morning light filled room 304 with an unusual serenity. Ethan held Charlie's leash, his eyes fixed on the window. There was an emptiness in the room, but also a peace that no one could explain. Sarah and Michael, sitting next to their son, felt the weight of the loss but also the strength of what Charlie had done. When Dr. Coleman entered with the test results, his expression reflected confusion. "Ethan isn't just improving, he's stronger than we expected. This doesn't make sense." He looked at the parents, hesitating. Is there something you're not telling me?" Sarah took a deep breath before responding. It was love. Charlie gave everything for our son. The doctor just nodded, speechless, and left, leaving behind a sense of mystery that no one could explain. Later that day, Ethan asked to walk in the hospital garden. With his parents' help, he slowly walked to a bench under a tree. He suddenly stopped and pointed to the empty lawn ahead. "He's here." Michael looked at Sarah, confused. "Charlie?" he asked. Ethan smiled softly. "He said he's okay, and he will always take care of us." The parents exchanged a tearful glance, feeling something beyond what they could comprehend. Back in the room, Ethan began to draw. The result left Sarah speechless, a portrait of Charlie next to a bright light, as if he were protecting the family. "He wants us to know he's happy," Ethan explained. The drawing was placed on the wall as a reminder of the dog's sacrifice and love. That night, Ethan slept soundly while Sarah and Michael sat beside him. Michael broke the silence. "Charlie showed us what true love is." Sarah nodded, holding her husband's hand. They knew that even though Charlie was gone, he remained present in every moment, uniting the family in a unique and eternal way. The days at the hospital came to an end when Ethan was finally discharged. The medical team applauded his departure, still amazed by the recovery that defied any explanation. Michael carried his son's backpack while Sarah held his hand, helping him walk slowly to the car. In Ethan's pocket, Charlie's collar remained, a talisman, a symbol of the love that had brought him back. Back home, Charlie's absence was palpable. The dog's bed was still in the corner of the room, and his toys, scattered about, seemed to remind the family of his loyalty. Ethan, however, didn't seem sad. He spent the afternoon drawing again, creating images of Charlie running through green fields under a bright sky. "He's happy now," Ethan said with a calm smile. "And he wants us to be happy too." Michael, watching his son, felt something stir within him. Inspired by all that Charlie had done, he suggested something new to the family. "What if we helped other animals the way Charlie helped us? We can do it in his honor." Sarah smiled, moved by the idea. "I think he would love that." From that day on, the family began visiting animal shelters, helping care for abandoned dogs and finding homes for them. Ethan, still in recovery, became enthusiastically involved, always sharing Charlie's story with anyone who would listen. Every act of kindness seemed to strengthen the invisible bond they still felt with the dog. Time passed, but Charlie's memory remained alive, not only in the hearts of Ethan, Sarah, and Michael, but also in the lives of countless animals touched by his legacy. They understood that the love they had received never disappeared. It had simply transformed into something even greater. And so, Charlie's journey continued, not just as a memory, but as a force that inspired the family and everyone around them to spread the unconditional love he had shown.